April 25th, 1945, 11:30 a.m., Meitingen, Germany. The air here doesn't just smell like the final spring of the war. It smells like cordite, burnt oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood mixing with wet mud. The men of Company G, 179th Infantry Regiment, are currently experiencing the longest minutes of their lives. They are pinned down in a field that has become a kill zone, trapped by the one weapon every Allied infantryman feared more than a Tiger tank, the German 20mm Flak gun. These guns were designed to shred aircraft in the sky, but on the ground, they turn human beings into a red mist in seconds. The American advance has stopped dead. The soldiers are pressed so hard into the dirt they're practically trying to bury themselves alive. And then, something impossible happens. Through the smoke and the deafening rhythm of the German cannons, a single man stands up. He isn't carrying a rifle, and he isn't looking for cover. He runs toward a standard-issue Willys Jeep that has an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the back. Most men would call this a suicide mission. A Jeep has no armor. It is a tin box on wheels. To the Germans behind those Flak guns, it is a target too big to miss. But Llewellyn Chilson doesn't wait for a crew, and he doesn't wait for a gunner. He jumps into the driver's seat alone. What happens next is a scene that belongs in a high-budget action movie, yet every word of it is documented in a congressional record. Chilson grips the steering wheel with his left hand and slams the Jeep into gear. With his right hand, he reaches back, grabs the spade handles of the heavy machine gun, and begins to fire. He is driving a vehicle through a literal storm of lead, steering with one hand and unleashing 50 caliber death with the other. He isn't just driving, he is hunting. He charges directly at the German positions, the Jeep bouncing wildly over craters, his one hand keeping the vehicle from flipping, while his other hand mows down everything in his path. By the time the smoke clears, the silence is deafening. In less than 10 minutes, the impossible has become reality. 40 German soldiers are dead. 2 of those terrifying 20mm Flak guns have been silenced forever. An entire American company that was seconds away from being wiped out is suddenly standing up, staring in disbelief at the man in the Jeep. Llewellyn Chilson just clears his throat, wipes the soot from his face, and prepares for the next town. He has just performed one of the most insane acts of combat in the history of the United States military, and for him, it was just another Tuesday. Fast forward to December 6th, 1946. The setting is the White House. President Harry S. Truman is standing in front of a quiet, unassuming man from Pennsylvania. In a ceremony that has never been repeated before or since, the president pins 7 different medals for valor onto Chilson's chest all at once. Truman leans in, looks Chilson in the eye, and says words that would echo through military history. "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." He calls Chilson the greatest soldier in the history of the nation. Yet, if you walk down the street today and ask anyone who Llewellyn Chilson was, you'll likely get a blank stare. He is the legend that history almost forgot, the truck driver who became a one-man army. To understand how a man can drive with one hand and destroy a platoon with the other, we have to go back to where the steel was forged. Llewellyn Chilson wasn't born into a world of glory or privilege. He was born into the grit and smog of an era where survival was a daily calculation. His story begins in 1920, but the shadows of the past were already looming over him. His father, Arthur Chilson, was a veteran of the First Great War, a man who had seen the horrifying transition of warfare into the industrial age. Growing up as the son of a World War I soldier meant that the concept of duty wasn't just a lesson, it was the atmosphere of the house. But the stability of that home was shattered early. When Llewellyn was only 10 years old, his mother passed away. In an instant, the color drained out of his childhood. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a survivor in a family that was about to be hit by the greatest economic collapse in human history. The Great Depression didn't just take people's money, it took their time and their youth. By the time Llewellyn was 16, the luxury of an education was a dream he could no longer afford. He dropped out of school, but he didn't go to the streets. He went to the driver's seat. He became a cross-state truck driver, maneuvering massive, heavy-duty rigs across the rugged, unpaved mountain passes of Pennsylvania and Ohio. You have to understand what driving a truck meant in the 1930s. There was no power steering. There were no synchronized transmissions. Steering one of those behemoths was a full-body workout. It required a grip like a vice and a level of spatial awareness that most people never develop. On those narrow, winding roads, Chilson learned how to handle a vehicle that was fighting him at every turn. He learned how to keep one hand on the wheel to maintain control, while the other was constantly working the complex gear shifters. He didn't know it yet, but these grueling years on the road were his unofficial basic training. He was developing the freakish forearm strength and the split-second reflexes that would one day allow him to turn a bouncy military jeep into a stable firing platform. When the world went to war again in 1942, Chilson didn't hesitate. He was inducted into the army and eventually found himself in the 45th Infantry Division, famously known as the Thunderbirds. This wasn't just any unit. The 45th would go on to spend more days in combat than almost any other division in the entire US military. Chilson himself would eventually clock 511 days of continuous combat. Think about that number for a second. That is nearly a year and a half of living in holes, eating cold rations, and waking up every single morning knowing that someone was actively trying to kill you. Most men break after 60 or 90 days of that kind of stress. Chilson didn't break. He hardened. He moved from a private to a technical sergeant, gaining a reputation among his peers as a man who was eerily calm when the lead started flying. But beneath that professional calm, a colder fire had begun to burn. Sometime in 1944, word reached the front that his brother, Alvin Chilson, had been killed in action in the Pacific Theater. The loss of his brother stripped away whatever caution Llewellyn had left. The war was no longer just a national duty. It had become a personal vendetta. He began to fight with the terrifying abandonment of a man who felt he had already lost what mattered most. He wasn't the loudest guy in the barracks, and he wasn't looking for medals. He was a professional who viewed combat through the same lens he viewed truck driving. It was a job that required precision, endurance, and the ability to stay cool when the machine was redlining. By the time he reached the shores of Italy, the boy who lost his mother and the teenager who fought mountain roads had become a weapon of war. By February 1944, the Mediterranean sun offered no warmth to the men trapped on the Anzio beachhead in Italy. What was supposed to be a strategic masterstroke to bypass the German winter line had turned into a static, soul-crushing nightmare. The Allies were huddled in a tiny pocket of sand and marsh, surrounded by German forces who held all the high ground. The Germans called it their internment camp, where they could shell the Americans at will. For months, the men lived in shallow foxholes filled with freezing water, listening to the Anzio Express, massive German railway guns that sent shells the size of cars screaming overhead. This was the environment where Llewellyn Chilson faced his first true test of survival, and it began with a disaster. During a brutal German counteroffensive, Chilson's position was overrun. In the chaos of smoke and screaming metal, he found himself staring down the barrels of several German rifles. Outnumbered and with nowhere to run, he was forced to drop his weapon. For most soldiers, being captured is the end of the war, a transition into a life of barbed wire and starvation in a POW camp. As the German guards began marching Chilson and a few other Americans toward the rear of the Axis lines, the situation looked hopeless. They were being moved away from their friends, away from their safety, and deeper into enemy-held territory. But the Germans made one fatal mistake. They assumed that because they had taken Chilson's gun, they had taken his will to fight. They didn't realize that the man they were guarding had spent his youth fighting heavy machinery in Pennsylvania winters. As they trudged through the mud, Chilson wasn't looking at the ground in defeat. He was watching his captors with the cold, calculating eyes of a hunter. He noticed the way the guards slung their MP-40 submachine guns. He watched the rhythm of their footsteps and the way their attention flickered toward the horizon every time an Allied shell exploded in the distance. He was waiting for a gap in their armor, a single moment of distraction. That moment came when a nearby artillery strike shook the earth, sending a fountain of dirt into the air and momentarily blinding the German guards. In that heartbeat of confusion, Chilson didn't run away. He ran at them. With the raw strength he had developed hauling freight across state lines, Chilson lunged at the nearest guard. Before the German could even process the movement, Chilson's hands were on him. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a desperate, visceral struggle for life. Chilson managed to rip the submachine gun away from the guard's shoulder, swinging the heavy metal butt of the weapon to neutralize him. Before the other guards could bring their rifles to bear, Chilson had the MP-40 leveled at them. The roles had flipped in a matter of seconds. The man who had been a prisoner just moments ago was now the one holding the trigger. Chilson didn't just stop at freeing himself. He rounded up the 4 German guards who had been escorting him and forced them to put their hands behind their heads. Under the cover of the smoke and the ongoing artillery duel, He navigated his way back through the treacherous no-man's land of the Anzio front. When he finally reached the American outposts, his fellow soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Out of the haze emerged a lone paratrooper, thought to be lost or dead, marching 4 dejected Germans back to base at gunpoint. He didn't want a parade or a pat on the back. He handed over the prisoners, grabbed a fresh American rifle, and asked where the front line was moving next. This incident at Anzio was the first time his superiors saw the Chilson factor, a complete refusal to accept a losing hand. It was a dark preview of the carnage he would later unleash as he fought his way toward the heart of the Third Reich. By late 1944, the momentum of the war had shifted. The Allies were no longer just holding on to beachheads. They were a juggernaut rolling across Western Europe. But as the German army was pushed back toward its own borders, it became more desperate and more dangerous. For Llewellyn Chilson, this period was not about a single moment of luck, but a terrifyingly consistent display of tactical genius. It was during the push through France and into the German heartland that he transformed from a brave soldier into a legend that his comrades spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. On November 26, 1944, near the town of Gumbrechtshoffen, France, Chilson's unit found itself staring up at a nightmare. The Germans had dug into a series of hills, fortifying them with multiple machine gun nests. In the woods of the Vosges Mountains, the sound of an MG-42, often called Hitler's buzzsaw because of its terrifying 1,200 round per minute firing rate, was enough to paralyze even the bravest men. The crossfire was perfect. If you moved left, the first gun got you. If you moved right, the second gun finished the job. The American advance stalled as the hillside turned into a wall of lead. Chilson, seeing the stalemate, didn't wait for a flanking maneuver or an artillery strike that might take hours to arrive. He simply began to climb. He moved with a predatory silence, using the terrain in ways that defied basic infantry training. Under the cover of the very fire that was pinning his friends down, he crawled and sprinted through the frozen brush until he was on top of the first German position. He didn't just suppress the enemy, he dismantled them. Single-handedly, he took out the first nest, then transitioned immediately to the second, and then the third. By the time the rest of his platoon reached the top of the hill, the fighting was already over. Chilson stood there among 3 silenced machine gun positions, with 9 German prisoners staring at him in total shock. He had broken the German defense of the hill by himself, opening the door for the entire battalion to move forward. For this action, he was awarded the Silver Star, but it was just a preview of what was coming as they reached the Rhine River. As March 1945 arrived, the Allied armies faced their greatest geographic obstacle, the Rhine. Crossing the river meant entering the German homeland, where the resistance was fanatical. Near the town of Horsdorf, shortly after the crossing, Chilson's company was once again blocked, this time by an urban stronghold. A massive stone building had been converted into a fortress, bristling with snipers and automatic weapons that covered every approach. It was a classic urban death trap. Chilson, now a seasoned technical sergeant, realized that a standard frontal assault would cost dozens of lives. He handpicked a small team, but as the bullets began to ricochet off the cobblestones, he once again ended up leading from the very front. He didn't just give orders, he was the first man through the door. In the cramped, smoke-filled corridors of the Horsdorf stronghold, the fighting was room to room and breath to breath. Chilson moved through the building like a force of nature, clearing floor after floor with a combination of grenades and precision fire. By the time he emerged from the other side of the structure, he had personally cleared the way for his entire unit to occupy the town. This wasn't just bravery. It was a level of combat efficiency that was starting to look supernatural. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at the Rhine, placing him in an elite bracket of soldiers. But even with a Silver Star and a DSC on his rack, Chilson was still just getting started. The war was in its final weeks, and the man from Pennsylvania was about to have a date with a Jeep that would cement his name in the halls of military immortality. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was a wounded animal, cornered and lashing out with everything it had left. The German resistance had become unpredictable. Some units surrendered in masses, while others fought with a suicidal fanaticism. On the morning of April 25th, in the small town of Meitingen, Germany, Company G ran headfirst into the latter. The American advance didn't just slow down, it hit a brick wall of high-velocity steel. The Germans had positioned 2 20mm flak guns at a strategic bottleneck, and they were using them with devastating efficiency. These weren't just machine guns. They were light cannons capable of punching through brick walls and turning a squad of men into a memory in a single burst. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and pulverized stone, and the Americans were pinned in the open, dying one by one. Llewellyn Chilson looked at the carnage and realized that if nobody did anything in the next 60 seconds, his entire company would be slaughtered. He saw a lonely Willys Jeep parked near a hedgerow, its M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun, the legendary Mardeuse, pointing toward the sky. To any sane person, that Jeep was a coffin. It had no doors, no roof, and absolutely no armor plating. Against 20mm cannons, it was as flimsy as a cardboard box. But Chilson wasn't thinking about safety. He was thinking about the physics of the kill. He sprinted through a hail of tracers, the ground erupting in geysers of dirt around his boots, and threw himself into the driver's seat. This is the moment that transformed Chilson from a soldier into a phenomenon. He didn't have a driver, and he didn't have a gunner. He had to be both. He slammed the Jeep into gear with his left hand and gripped the steering wheel, while his right hand reached back to grab the spade handles of the .50 cal. This wasn't just driving. It was a high-stakes balancing act that defied every bit of Army regulation. The Jeep roared to life, tires screaming as it tore across the uneven, debris-strewn field. Chilson had to steer with his left hand to navigate around craters and obstacles, keeping the vehicle moving at high speed so the German gunners couldn't get a lead on him. Simultaneously, he realized he couldn't possibly swing the heavy gun and steer at the same time. So, he relied on a mechanic's instinct. He aimed by driving. He locked the heavy machine gun in a fixed position with his right hand and used the entire Jeep as his sight. If he needed to sweep fire to the left, he swerved the car left. If he needed to hit a target to the right, he jerked the wheel right. The Germans were stunned. They were used to fighting infantry who crawled in the mud, not a madman in a Jeep charging them at 40 miles per hour. Chilson drove straight into the mouth of the beast. The 20mm cannons swung toward him, but the Jeep was too fast, too erratic. Chilson leaned into the steering, drifting the vehicle to create a wider field of fire, and then he opened up. He moved with a terrifying fluid motion, his left hand wrestling the steering wheel to keep the Jeep from flipping on the rough terrain, while his right hand unleashed a stream of heavy slugs that disintegrated the sandbag fortifications. In a frantic, blurred 10 minutes of combat, the tide of the entire battle flipped. Chilson didn't just suppress the enemy, he annihilated them. He drove the Jeep right up to the German gun pits, the heat from the .50 caliber barrel shimmering in the air. By the time he finally brought the vehicle to a halt, 40 German soldiers lay dead. Both 20mm Flak guns, the weapons that had been shredding his company just minutes before, were smoking ruins. As the dust settled and the silence returned to Meitingen, the men of Company G emerged from the dirt, staring at the lone man in the Jeep. His clothes were torn, his face was masked in black soot, and his hands were likely cramped from the sheer physical effort of the feat. He had just won a small war by himself, steering with one hand and dealing death with the other. The path to the heart of Germany was open, and Llewellyn Chilson was the man who had kicked the door down. The fires of the Second World War finally burned out in May 1945, but for Llewellyn Chilson, the return to a world at peace was perhaps the strangest transition of all. He didn't come home to a parade in the streets of Philadelphia or a Hollywood movie deal. Instead, he returned to the quiet, rolling hills of Pennsylvania, carrying a heavy footlocker filled with more metal and ribbon than almost any other man in the history of the United States Army. The sheer volume of his heroism was so vast that it took the military bureaucracy over a year to process the paperwork. On December 6, 1946, the world finally caught a glimpse of the man who had terrified the German army from the seat of a Jeep. There was an irony to the moment, however. The man standing before the president was technically a civilian. Chilson had already been honorably discharged months earlier, in June, but the army had to recall him to Washington because the backlog of his awards was so massive it had outlasted his enlistment. In a ceremony at the White House that remains unique in American history, President Harry S. Truman stood before Tech Sergeant Chilson. On a table nearby sat 7 distinct decorations for valor. In a single, extraordinary moment, Truman pinned all 7 of them onto Chilson's uniform at once. 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, the nation's second highest award, 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart. As Truman felt the weight of the medals on the young man's chest, he paused. He looked at the former truck driver, a man who had survived 511 days of hell and had single-handedly neutralized nearly 100 enemies, and spoke with a raw, unscripted sincerity. "I would rather have this medal," Truman said, gesturing to the Distinguished Service Cross, "than be President of the United States." But there was a ghost at that ceremony, a medal that wasn't on the table. Despite the fact that his commanding officer had recommended him for the Medal of Honor not once, but 3 separate times for 3 different actions, Llewellyn Chilson never received the nation's highest award. Military historians have spent decades debating why. Some cite bureaucratic errors in the heat of the final push toward Berlin. Others point to the fact that his actions were so frequent and so routine for him that the paperwork simply couldn't keep up with his pace of destruction. He became a victim of his own consistency. Because he performed miracles every Tuesday, the army eventually began to treat his miracles as standard operating procedure. He remains the most decorated soldier of World War II to be denied the Medal of Honor, a fact that his fellow Thunderbirds of the 45th Division viewed as a profound historical injustice. Chilson, however, never joined the debate. He didn't complain, he didn't write a memoir, and he didn't lobby Congress to fix the record. Like so many of the greatest generation, he simply put his uniform in a closet and went back to work. The man who had unleashed a storm of .50 caliber fire at Meitingen moved to the state of Washington and took a job managing a local gas station. His wife, Mary, was the only person who truly knew the weight of what he had done. To everyone else, he was simply a gentle giant. For years, customers would pull up to the pump, hand their keys to a quiet, polite man with steady hands, and never realize they were being served by one of the most lethal combatants in human history. The hands that had once destroyed a German platoon were now used to gently tune engines and help neighbors. He lived a life of profound humility, preferring the company of his family and the rhythm of a normal day to the spotlight of his wartime exploits. Llewellyn Chilson passed away in 1981 at the age of 61 while on vacation in Florida. He was buried with full military honors, but without the national fame that accompanied names like Audie Murphy or Alvin York. His story tells us something fundamental about the nature of courage. It isn't always found in the loudest voice or the biggest frame. Sometimes it is found in a 10-year-old boy who survives the loss of his mother, a 16-year-old who masters the heavy steel of a mountain truck, and a sergeant who refuses to surrender, even when a gun is pressed against his gut. Llewellyn Chilson was the man who drove into the mouth of death with one hand on the wheel and the other on the trigger. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because his friends were in trouble and he was the only one with a Jeep and a clear line of sight. He remains a reminder that the greatest legends are often the ones who never asked to be remembered. He was a truck driver from Pennsylvania who became a one-man army, and then, when the job was done, he simply went back to being a neighbor. History may have misplaced his paperwork, but for the men of Company G who survived because of him, his name is written in something far more permanent than ink. It is written in the very fact that they made it home at all. If you believe Llewellyn Chilson deserves to be as household a name as Audie Murphy, or if you think the military bureaucracy of 1946 committed a grave error by withholding that 3rd recommendation for the Medal of Honor, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. His story was nearly lost to the dusty shelves of the National Archives. But by staying until the end of this video, you have helped keep the memory of his incredible sacrifice alive. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories of these legends who never asked for the spotlight, the ones whose courage changed the world, but whose names have faded into the background. If you found value in this deep dive into the life of one of America's greatest forgotten warriors, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into history's most remarkable lives. Share this video with someone who needs to know that true heroism often wears the most humble clothes. Until next time, remember that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield isn't the machine. It is the person with the will to master it. Thank you for watching.